On December 7th, 1971, police officers stepped into one of the wealthiest homes in Westfield, New Jersey. Classical music echoed softly through the mansion. The lights were still on. The house was freezing cold, and every room was almost unnaturally clean. Officers called out into the silence as their footsteps moved across the cold floors of the sprawling home known as Breeze Knoll. No one answered, but the music kept playing through the intercom system. Then came the horrifying discovery. One body, then another, and another. 5 members of the List family had been dead inside the mansion for nearly a month. The man responsible was nowhere to be found. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, no ransom demands. Just an empty house, carefully staged like the family had simply vanished. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where I examine the psychology, the people, and the moments that lead to the most extreme acts of violence, and what happens when the darkness finally meets the light. Today's case is the story of John List, a respected accountant, Sunday school teacher, husband, and father who methodically murdered his entire family before disappearing almost without a trace. And for nearly 18 years, he successfully erased himself from existence. But this case is about more than murder. It's about shame, control, religious extremism, financial collapse, and the terrifying power of appearances. Because to the outside world, the List family looked perfect. And sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who spend their entire lives making sure no one can see them unravel. Tonight, we're examining how a man who appeared deeply ordinary became one of America's most infamous family annihilators, and how he almost got away with it forever. John List was, by nearly every outward metric, the kind of man that people simply trusted. He was born in 1925 and raised in a strict Lutheran household. List grew up believing discipline, obedience, and morality were not just suggestions. They were obligations. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of his worldview, and those rigid beliefs would follow him throughout his entire life. After serving in the military during World War II and later the Korean War, List built what appeared to be a stable and respectable life. He worked as an accountant, taught Sunday school, and projected the image of a quiet, dependable family man. But beneath that polished exterior was someone intensely preoccupied with control. List was intelligent and methodical, but also emotionally cold and very authoritarian. He believed in strict order within his household and expected absolute obedience from his family. Appearances mattered enormously to him, not just socially, but spiritually. To John List, success was tied to morality. Financial stability, religious devotion, and public responsibility were all parts of his identity that he desperately needed to maintain. And by the early 70s, that image was collapsing. Behind the walls of the massive List family mansion, John was drowning in financial ruin, humiliation, and fear that other people would discover the truth about his failures. Rather than simply admit that he had lost control, investigators believed that List became consumed by the idea that he alone had the right to decide his family's fate. Before we get into what happened inside Breeze Knoll, it's important to slow down and treat the List household the way that it should be treated. Not as background noise to this crime, but as a group of individual lives that were fully in motion before they were taken. Because when we talk about John List's family, we're not talking about abstract people here. These are people who woke up, made plans, had routines, arguments, dreams, and none of them knew their lives were approaching a hard stop. First was Helen List. Helen was John's wife, and by most accounts, she lived a life that became increasingly isolated over time. She struggled with significant health issues, including late-stage syphilis that had gone untreated for years before her marriage. By the time the family reached Westfield, she was dealing with both a physical decline and emotional strain. Her relationship with John was complicated, marked by distance, stress, and growing sense of disconnection inside their home. Whatever stability the marriage once had, it eroded into something quiet and very heavy. Then came Alma List. Alma was John's mother, and she lived with the family at Breeze Knoll. She was a dominant presence in his life long before the house in New Jersey. Alma owned the property, and that alone created an undercurrent of power and resentment from John. She was outspoken, very critical, and she frequently publicly questioned John's choices, especially when it came to money and success. For a man who was already obsessed with control and appearances, having his mother in the same house, someone who never hesitated to challenge him, only deepened his sense of pressure and failure. Now, Patricia List was 16 years old. She was at the beginning of the version of life that never got to fully unfold. Patricia was interested in acting, in school, in her friends, the normal pull of teenage independence. She was at that age where identity starts expanding outward, and the home is just one part of a much larger world. And like many teenagers, she was starting to push gently against John's parental control and trying to define herself outside of it. John List Jr. was 15. He played soccer. He was described as very active, social, and increasingly aware of the tension within his home. Like many teenage boys, he was growing into himself, testing boundaries, and forming opinions that didn't always align with his father's rigid expectations. The natural push and pull between father and son was becoming more visible in the months leading up to 1971. And finally, Frederick List was 13 years old. The youngest son, quiet, more reserved, and still deeply tied to the structure of family life. He was still in the phase where routine matters, where the home is the center of everything. Frederick's world was smaller, more contained, and still entirely dependent on the adults surrounding him. It's easy when looking at a case like this to let the scale of it blur the individuals involved, to let the numbers replace their names. But that's what we shouldn't do. These were not symbols in John List's collapse. They were not background pieces in a financial failure or extensions of a man's pride, no matter what he thought. They were real people with relationships and futures, and it all ended inside this home. And in the center of it all was the person who controlled the environment they lived in, John List, shaping a home that was not a normal home. They called it Breeze Knoll, and it was a statement. A 19-room Victorian estate in Westfield, New Jersey. It sat elevated and imposing, the kind of property that was meant to signal success before a single word was spoken. On paper, it was impressive, sprawling, ornate, and filled with the architectural confidence of a bygone era that still carried a lot of weight in modern suburbia. Inside the house, it was even more dramatic. There was a massive ballroom that felt out of place in the quiet residential area, a space designed for gatherings that, by the time the John List family lived there, never got used. Above it all sat a Tiffany stained glass skylight, filtering daylight into fractured color patterns that should have felt beautiful, but instead seemed distant and almost abandoned. And beneath that elegance was something heavy, decay masked by status. Breeze Knoll was expensive to maintain, difficult to heat, and increasingly impractical for a family under financial strain. The rooms sat unused, hallways stretched longer than they needed to. The cold settled into the structure itself, especially during New Jersey winters, where keeping a house of that size warm became a constant losing battle. And that's what makes the mansion feel like more than a setting in this story. It's almost like its own character. Oversized, isolated, and slowly falling out of reach, it mirrors the life inside of it. Outwardly respectable, internally unstable, and increasingly impossible to sustain without everything eventually giving way. The collapse of the List household didn't begin with violence, though. It started with silence, secrecy, and a man trying to hold together an image that no longer matched his reality. On the surface, John still looked like he was functioning in his role as a provider. But in truth, he had lost his very prestigious bank job, a position that had anchored his sense of identity and respectability in the community. Rather than confront the humiliation or tell his family the truth, he constructed an elaborate illusion. Every morning, he would get dressed for work and leave the house. And instead of looking for jobs, he spent long hours sitting inside of train stations, reading newspapers, and just waiting out the day. And inside Breeze Knoll, the consequences of that deception slowly started to accumulate. Without any income, He began quietly draining his mother's bank accounts to keep the household afloat. Bills went unpaid, financial pressure mounted, utilities became unreliable. The physical reality of the home began to mirror the instability underneath of it. The heat was harder to maintain, all of the expenses harder to cover, and the weight of the debt grew heavier with each passing month. But the unraveling didn't just stay financial, it took a psychological turn. Religion had originally given structure to John List's worldview, but it began to change and twist into something more rigid and consuming. He increasingly saw himself not as a man who had failed professionally, but as a failed patriarch in the eyes of God. In his mind, his ability to provide was not merely a practical failure, it was a moral failure, a spiritual failure. And from there, the thinking became more distorted. He began to view his household as something that was slipping out of his control, a family now exposed to poverty, instability, and what he interpreted as moral decay. Where others would see financial collapse, List saw spiritual corruption. Where other people might see crisis, he saw only judgment. And this was the critical turning point because it explains how, in its own internal logic, John began to frame the unthinkable, not as destruction, but as a kind of grim correction. By November of 1971, John List was no longer thinking about escape. He was thinking about annihilation. And the date mattered. Everything about these murders was built around routine, timing, and invisibility. School schedules aligned in a way that would stagger the family's movements throughout the house. Mail deliveries could be stopped, paused, milk deliveries canceled. Fewer neighbors would ask immediate questions. And List carefully constructed a window of silence large enough for the entire family to disappear before anyone really noticed. And that's what makes this case chilling. It wasn't an impulsive violence. John planned this down to the minute. And on the morning of November 9th, after the children left for school, Liz began moving through the plan he had already rehearsed. He shot his wife Helen in the kitchen. Then he walked upstairs and murdered his mother Alma in her bed. Afterward, the house fell quiet. Not chaotic, not frantic, but quiet. Instead of fleeing, though, List remained inside Breeze Knoll for hours. He cleaned up parts of the scene, organized the house, moved through rooms with the calmness of someone carrying out a schedule rather than reacting to horror. Outside the mansion, life continued normally. Neighbors went to work, teachers expected to see the List children in class the next morning, newspapers accumulated, phone calls went unanswered. Inside the house, John waited. When Patricia and Frederick returned home later that day, he murdered them individually as they entered the house. There was no confrontation, no warning, no chance to understand what was happening to them. And the terrifying part, it wasn't rage, it was betrayal. That their father was inside the home waiting for them. 2 shots, and they were gone. But the final murder carries a different emotional weight. Instead of remaining in the home, List left the murder scene entirely and he drove to John Jr.'s soccer game. Witnesses later recalled nothing unusual about him. He stood there watching his son play as though the world inside of Breeze Knoll had not ended. Then he drove John Jr. home, killed him last. Unlike the others, there was evidence that John Jr. knew what was happening, that he fought back. There were signs of a struggle inside the home. A sudden rupture in the sterile order that List had tried so carefully to maintain. That detail matters because it breaks the illusion of control. Even in the end, he still couldn't control all 5 members of his household. John Jr. pushed against the calm, methodical image that List was trying to preserve. And then after the murders, he began staging the house like a performance. He placed all of the bodies on sleeping bags in the ballroom beneath the stained glass skylight. He turned on every light in the mansion, turned the radio to a classical music station connected to the home's intercom system so that music would continue through the halls after he was gone. He cleaned parts of the crime scene very carefully Then came the weirdest detail of all. He cut his own face out of every family photograph in the house. He couldn't just murder them. The goal was erasure. And then before leaving, he wrote a 5-page confessional letter and addressed it to his pastor. In it, he said that he killed his family to save their souls. He said that poverty would pull them away from God and that death was preferable to the moral corruption and spiritual decay of being poor. And that contradiction is what makes this case so haunting. A Sunday school teacher framing familicide as salvation? Then he locked the house, left all the lights on, and disappeared. For nearly a month after the murders, Breeze Knoll sat in silence. At first, the absence of the List family didn't immediately trigger any alarms. John had carefully arranged things to buy himself some time. He had already stopped all of the deliveries. The children's school absences had been explained away, and from the outside, the mansion simply looked quiet. But eventually, the stillness became impossible to ignore. Neighbors noticed that the curtains remained drawn every single day. Teachers wondered why the List children had been missing for longer than normal vacation time. The students' classmates started asking questions. No one ever answered the phone. And then the massive house on the hill, once illuminated as a symbol of wealth and status, began to feel strangely lifeless. And on December 7th, 1971, police finally entered Breeze Knoll. Inside, they described the atmosphere as almost unreal. They said the air was freezing cold, the heat had long since failed in parts of the mansion, and the house was chilly based on November cold that had settled into the walls. The light still glowed within the home, and it casted an artificial warmth across the empty rooms. Classical music echoed softly through the intercom system, the same way that Liszt had intended. Dust had settled over untouched furniture. Plates sat where they had been left. Rooms remained unnaturally orderly. The entire house felt suspended in time, like abandoned mid-sentence. Then the officers found the bodies. And as investigators processed the scene, another realization emerged immediately. John List was gone. His car was located at a JFK airport, strongly suggesting he had planned his escape before the murders took place. This wasn't somebody who had panicked. He thought through transportation, timing, and disappearance, all with the same cold precision he had used to plan and kill his family. And the investigators then faced an unusual and deeply frustrating obstacle. There were no reliable recent photographs of him left behind. Inside, the police discovered that he had cut his face out of every family photograph. And it sounds bizarre, almost theatrical, but the effect was devastatingly practical for the era. There were no digital databases, no facial recognition software, or widespread surveillance cameras. Photographs mattered enormously, and by removing himself from visual record, List made it significantly harder for authorities to circulate an accurate image of the man they were hunting. They had one picture, an older picture of John when he was much younger. And that stalled everything. Years pass, more years. I mean, this was a cold case from the beginning, but it went colder. No arrest, no confirmed sightings, no clear identity trail leading investigators to where he could have gone, and gradually the case just drifted out of national attention. The murders at Breeze Knoll became one more horrifying story filed away in America's backlog of unsolved crimes. And in many ways, John List became exactly what he wanted to become: a ghost. And while investigators were searching for a fugitive, List started quietly rebuilding his life. He relocated to Colorado, adopted a new identity, Robert Clark. He found another accounting job, joined a different church, built another carefully constructed existence around routine, religion, suburban normalcy. Eventually, he got remarried to a woman named Dolores Miller. She had no idea that the very quiet man she married had murdered his entire family nearly 2 decades earlier. And that is probably the most disturbing part of this story. It's not just that he escaped, he blended back into normal American life so easily, so completely. For 18 years, the man behind one of the country's most infamous family annihilations sat in churches, held conversations, paid bills, and moved through neighborhoods without anyone realizing who he really was. By 1989, the case of John List had faded from public attention. Nearly 18 years had passed since the murders at Breeznell, and investigators were no closer to finding him. Every lead had dried up. Witness sightings, there weren't any. The man who annihilated his family had simply disappeared into thin air. Then the case landed in the hands of the television program America's Most Wanted. Producers believed national exposure could finally generate new leads. But investigators immediately faced a major problem. Every usable photo of John List was badly outdated. Most were over 2 decades old. Even worse, he had deliberately removed himself from any recent family photos, leaving authorities only with that limited visual record of what he used to look like. If this broadcast was going to work, viewers needed to see not the man from 1971, but who he might become. That's when investigators turned to a man named Frank Bender. Bender was more than just your normal forensic artist. He was known for combining sculpture, anatomy, investigative intuition, and psychological profiling in ways that felt almost uncanny. He didn't simply recreate faces. He tried to understand the people behind those faces. And in the List case, that distinction is significant. Rather than simply mechanically aging an old photograph, Bender began studying the deeper patterns of John List himself. His bone structure, facial aging, likely weight gain, posture, habits, his personality traits. He examined the psychology of a man who was obsessed with conformity and invisibility. In Bender's mind, List would not reinvent himself dramatically. He wouldn't become flashy or eccentric. A man like List would hide by becoming forgettable. Conservative clothing, extra weight from age and routine, maybe some thick-rimmed glasses. The face of an ordinary suburban accountant, and no one would look twice. As Bender sculpted, clay slowly layered over the facial structure. Wrinkles and softened skin lines were added very carefully. The face aged under his hands, decade by decade, until the reconstruction stopped looking like a forensic exercise and looked disturbingly real. Less like a fugitive poster and more like a man quietly sitting behind you in a church pew. When Bender finally added the glasses, the transformation clicked into place. The bust looked like someone hiding in plain sight. And then the episode aired nationally on America's Most Wanted. And almost immediately the breakthrough came. A woman in Virginia recognized the recognition at once. The man on television looked exactly like her neighbor, a quiet accountant named Bob Clark. In reality, Bob was John, and on June 1st, 1989, the FBI arrived at his home. At first, List denied everything, calmly, carefully, but the denial didn't really last long. Fingerprints confirmed the truth investigators had spent nearly 2 decades chasing. After 18 years of hiding, they had found the ghost. When John List finally stood trial in 1990, the case wasn't about finding him. It was about understanding whether the man who had spent nearly 2 decades hiding behind an ordinary suburban identity could convince a jury that the murders were the result of a mental collapse rather than deliberate choice. And List's defense team, they tried it. They tried multiple explanations for his actions. They argued that his years of military service had left him psychologically damaged. They said he probably had PTSD. They raised claims of obsessive compulsive disorder. They suggested that his financial ruin and subsequent humiliation had led to emotional deterioration, and it gradually pushed him beyond rational thinking. Then the defense tried to paint the murders as the actions of a man who was psychologically unraveling under the impossible pressures he had set for himself. But the prosecution focused on something that was Very difficult to explain away. The planning, because nearly every detail of these murders pointed towards organization, calculation, and control. Liz selected a date carefully around school schedules, neighborhood routines. He stopped all of the family's deliveries. He prepared for the delay in discovery. He waited calmly inside the home for hours in between the murders. He cleaned up the majority of the crime scene afterward. He arranged their bodies. He wrote letters. He staged the environment. Then he executed an sophisticated escape plan that had almost hidden him for 20 years. That is not the behavior of someone who is detached from reality. It's the behavior of someone managing their reality. And prosecutors repeatedly returned to the same central argument. This was not confusion. He calculatedly executed his family, and the jury agreed. In 1990, John List was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences. And for the rest of his life, he remained incarcerated, eventually dying in 2008 at the age of 82. But one final detail in the story lingers, almost like a cruel epilogue. Years after the murders, Breeze Knoll was destroyed in an arson fire. The massive Victorian mansion that had once symbolized wealth and status was reduced to ruins. But experts would examine the property and they discovered something astonishing. That stained glass ballroom skylight, the Tiffany piece, where he had arranged the bodies of his family, it was authentic and it was outrageously valuable. As in, valuable enough to relieve all of the financial pressure that was consuming List. That revelation adds a haunting layer of irony to the case. But I want to frame it correctly. The tragedy here was never simply a lack of options. There were paths other than annihilation. They could have sold the house, downsized. He could have confessed that he lost his job and then gotten a new one. It's not like it's hard to find an accounting job. Well, at least back then. He could have sought help. He could have spoken to his pastor. He could have abandoned the image that he was so desperate to preserve. But for John List, the collapse of that image was intolerable. Even though the Tiffany skylight would have saved the family from financial ruin, it wasn't about money. John was ashamed. And his need for control and the fear of being publicly humiliated turned him towards the unthinkable. This man who believed that authority over his family included the authority to decide whether they lived or died. That mindset, not poverty, not religion alone, not financial ruin by itself, is what ultimately turned Breeze Knoll into the crime scene. Cases like the story of John List force us to confront one of the most uncomfortable truths about violence. It doesn't always arrive looking monstrous. Sometimes it arrives wearing a suit. Sometimes it teaches Sunday school. Sometimes it smiles politely at the neighbors, attends church every week, and spends years building a reputation for being dependable, disciplined, and respectable. And that's what makes so many family annihilator cases so disturbing. The violence grows quietly behind closed doors, inside systems built on control, fear, shame, and the desperate need to maintain appearances at all costs. And when those systems start to collapse, the people inside the household become trapped inside someone else's unraveling. In many ways, John List viewed his family less as individuals and more like extensions of his own identity, reflections of his success, reflections of his morality and authority and his standing in the world. When his financial life began to collapse and that image he had worked so hard on started to fracture, he didn't seek vulnerability, honesty, or help. He retreated deeper into rigidity and control. And that combination is extremely dangerous. Untreated shame has a way of distorting reality. especially in people who believe that failure is unforgivable, especially in people who tie love to obedience, morality to appearances, and authority to ownership over the lives of the people around them. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is the normalcy around John List. So many people who encountered him described him in the same way: quiet, polite, intelligent, religious, respectable, ordinary. And sometimes ordinary is exactly what evil needs to hide behind. The most dangerous person in the room is not always the loudest, the most chaotic, or the most unstable. Sometimes it's the person who spent their entire life learning how to look composed while everything underneath is chaotic. The victims in this story, Helen, Alma, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick, they all deserved futures beyond Breeze Knoll. They deserved to live lives that were larger than fear, shame, and control. And they deserve to be remembered not just as another part of a notorious crime, but as people whose lives were stolen by someone who believed he had the right to decide their fate. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this has been When Killers Get Caught. And remember, the truth always leaves a trail. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and follow the podcast wherever you listen. And next time, we're heading to Texas to examine one of the strangest and most infamous true crime stories of the 1990s, the case of Wanda Holloway, a.k.a. the Texas Pom Pom Bomb. See you next week.